Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. Listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. So in your car as you're driving along in your truck, or put in those earbuds on public transport and close your eyes and absorb the information. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what are the actual real population numbers across the West. Now, remember, the West has been subject to nearly 2 decades now of mass migration. And for some reason, the government's numbers in all Western governments seem to stay strangely sort of similar. Now, all Western governments have an interest, because they're globalist controlled. There's no sovereign governments in the West anymore. They all seem to have an interest, and a vested interest, in pretending that the migration numbers are much lower than they actually are. So they're willfully and aggressively and treacherously lying in order to obscure the actuality. So what is the actuality? I mean, do we even know? Do they actually know? Does anybody know what the real numbers are? Now, if we look at the amount of, say, quantity of sewerage, water consumption, electricity consumption, those sorts of things, and say consumption of groceries through the chain, grocery chain stores, that sort of stuff, we can get a pretty good idea. And some of the modelling that the grocery store chains use and other stores is pretty sophisticated in terms of where the populations are, the purchasing power of those populations, these sorts of things. So this is something that we can get a pretty decent sort of guide as to what the population is. Now, the population of, for example, the United Kingdom, based on these these numbers, such as consumption of groceries, electricity consumption, water consumption, and so on, the population of the United Kingdom is around 15% higher than the government says it is. So depending on how you want to play those numbers, there's somewhere around between 10 and say an 11.5 million more citizens in the United Kingdom than the government is claiming. Now we can look at a few different things here. We can say, well, how do we classify citizens? Is it temporary residents? Is it people with work visas? Is it students? Is it the dependents of students? Is it something else? So by having an endless array of different classifications, the government can hide millions of people within those classifications and say, well, no, we haven't got many migrants here. There's only 5% black or something, when in reality it's much higher than that, and they just obscure it using different types of visas and different types of residency classifications. But putting that aside for 1 minute, what do the evidence of your eyes and sort of ears tell you? Now, the claim is that somewhere around 5% of the population of the UK is black. This is African black or Caribbean black. Now, how do they classify black? Is it 100% black? Is it 50%? What's the class? So there's playing around with classifications there. For example, in various statistical type processes in the United States, they classify Mexicans as white, and then they don't. They classify them as then Latino in another classification or another criteria. So again, the governments all play around and jump around with numbers, classifications, and definitions, which makes it hard to pin down what's going on in any given area, which is, of course, what the government wants. They want it to be as difficult as possible for you to work out what's going on. Now, let's suppose that the claim that 5% of the population of the United Kingdom is black. Let's just assume that's accurate for a moment. Now, the claim is that 80% of those live in London. Okay, all right. Well, let's take, so we can, if we extrapolate out, then that means somewhere on or about 18 to 20% of the population of London is black. Let's assume, just by crunching the numbers. This is simple mathematics, by the way, but by crunching numbers, then we can. So that would mean that on the trains or the tubes, that somewhere around 20%, give or take, of the trained population would be black. So, okay, now, and those black people are concentrated in certain areas. So you would assume if you caught a train that either was from or went through those areas, that you would get that overrepresentation. It'd be more than 18 or 20%, because 40% of the population of that district are black. So you would assume you'd get 40% plus from. You may find that other white commuters don't really want to use the train going through that area. So again, you may find an overrepresentation. So allowing for all those possibilities. I was staggered last time I was in London going through using the tube, and I was going through an area that was quite well to do. That there weren't black areas that the train was travelling through, and I was staggered at the amount of black people on the train. It was a few years since I'd been there, and I didn't use the trains very much. I guess that was another factor to consider. But over a period of, I don't know, less than 5 years, it went from seeing hardly any black people on the train to suddenly black people with the majority on the train going through a non-black area and coming from a non-black area. So I was more than surprised by that. So that would suggest, just based on the evidence of my eyes and ears. And this is, by the way, in a time of peak hour travel. So this is people, I presume, given that they're like traveling to work and so on. The black people seem to be fairly recent arrivals. Their habits, the way they walked and stood, and the way they behaved, and how many of them were picking their nose and flicking it around the train carriage, that would suggest they're only recently come from Africa, or a black community. So I thought, there's just looking at that, there's no way. There's only 5% of the people are black. They weren't the age of students either. So they weren't in their early 20s or late teens as students. So that was out. So these were people who'd come presumably to get work visas. Now maybe they were there illegal or not, I don't know. But they were the majority on the train that I, and again, it wasn't going through a black area. So this would suggest that there's many more black people than the government is letting on. Why is the government lying? I mean, for goodness sakes, why don't they just say it? But they're forcing mass migration on all Western countries without the consent of the citizens. In fact, in open and aggressive defiance of the wishes of the citizens, they're pushing mass migration. So that needs to be understood and realised. Now, I see the same in Sydney, for example. Now, we're told that only 25% of the white Australia population is 75 or 78% or something. The government's telling us. Now, this is clearly a lie. I mean, that's. But again, you could look at the classification and what constitutes a student or a short-term work visa, or students that have some sort of, they're allowed to work so many hours a week. These sorts of things. So this could skew what you see. But now I don't take public transport very often, but when I do, it's like a window into what's happening in the society. Unlike driving along in the car, where you're with your immediate family or something. But so looking at on the train, there are times, and not that it's rare, but there are times when I'm the only Anglo-Saxon in the train carriage. When the train passes certain platforms, as in train stops, train platforms, you'd be lucky to see any white people. If it is, it's one or two. It's just absolutely wall to wall thick with non-white people. Now, let's suppose that most of the folks that come to Australia live in the bigger cities, and Sydney being the biggest city, so it's where I live. Then you would assume there'd be an overrepresentation. So let's even cut some slack and say 35%. They've even say 40% of Sydney, 60% white, 40% non-white. Let's assume that for a moment. Then why does the train carriage not roughly represent that? Why, when I'm going through mostly white suburbs, and there's the schools are either kids going to school or coming from school. Why don't I hardly see any white students? Why are they all brown or black? Or I mean, mostly the majority of immigration in Australia comes from China and India and Philippines, that sort of thing. So you don't get a lot of blacks, but why is it that I don't hear English being spoken on the carriage? Why is it that those school kids have probably been born in Australia or they've come at a young age, yet they hang around in groups and they all talk, and I speak passable Mandarin so I can hear what they're saying. But why are they talking in Indian to each other or whatever, Mandarin or in the Philippines language? I speak some Spanish and I can pick up on the Philippines language there. They use a number of Spanish words in their vocabulary. So anyway, just sort of going through that. Why am I the only white person? Frequently, the only white person in the train carriage. That's just not possible, is it? I mean, statistically, that's simply not possible. Nor are these all uni student age, where you'd say, well, hold on a minute, there's a whole lot of kids going to college here or university in Australia, and that's giving the appearance of more migration there really is, because these people will presumably get their qualification and then go back to wherever. So, but I don't think that's the case. So we're being quite clearly lied to. If I go downtown into Sydney, and this is, I even go to an area where, by the way, is quite tourist intensive. But in that would be a spread of tourists. There'd be tourists from Europe and from Britain and from everywhere in this place. But there isn't, the non-white people are hopelessly outnumbered. We're talking 90-10. And that's the local white people living and working in downtown Sydney, and any white tourists that happen to be here. But still, they're outnumbered. Even say during say the normal or nominal lunch hour, it's still when white people working in the offices, for example, would be buzzing around, getting a sandwich or something like that. Even then, white people are in the decided minority. So my sort of my eyes and ears are telling me that the population, white people, are probably already in a minority in Australia. Certainly in the big cities, and there's not much of the population lives outside the big cities. So if you take the two biggest cities in Australia, they're pushing sort of, I don't know, well over a third of the population. So I would argue that certainly based on the evidence of my eyes and my ears, that what white people in minority. Now they could play a statistic around with this and say, well, we're only talking recent immigrants, not the children of immigrants. So okay, all right, that could skew numbers. I get that, right? Fine, but these people are still talking in their genetic original tongue, and I mean, how's that assimilation working? I mean, not so well from the looks of it. So. Now, coming to the United States, where there's allegedly 11 million illegal immigrants, living in the United States. Now, I first heard that number over 20 years ago, I think, and I assumed it at times, oh, well, and somehow, even though millions upon millions, gazillions of illegals have streamed into the United States, not simply just people crossing the border, which is obviously a huge issue, but we're talking about a mass, millions of visa overstays, which Australia gets a lot of. But Australia, most of the illegals in Australia are visa overstays. They're not people arriving illegally by boat. So, and there are many. Here again in Australia, there was I read an article a few years ago saying that the visa overstays in Australia were approximately 20,000, and the primary transgressors were Indians who got either student visas or got work visas, or in some cases even just tourist visas, and they still in the country. And then looking at this just a few months ago, there was an article claiming that the number is still exactly 20,000. visa overstays. I mean, that's clearly bullshit. How many visa overstays there are in Australia? I would argue, easily a million plus. And when you look at the amount of Indians and subcontinent people generally, like Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, that live 20 to a 2-bedroom apartment, then you get some idea of the probable scale of this. Now, coming back to the United States, though, somehow it stayed static at 11 million for 2 decades, even though something in the order of 44 to 45 million illegals have come into the United States during that time. So this would suggest, like, not including the ones who have been deported, this would suggest somewhere in the region of 45 to 55 million, depending on whose numbers you want to think about here, that 45 to 55 million illegals are living in the United States at the moment, flying under the radar somehow. There's got to be a lot of people who are just looking the other way on this. I mean, you couldn't have that many people and not notice it. I just don't believe that's possible. But now these numbers of say, something like 300, the population of the USA, if you include the legals, is 370 odd million. Again, the consumption of utilities, water, electricity, that sort of thing. Similarly, the consumption of mobile phones, consumption of groceries, that sort of stuff, volume of sewage would suggest that it's closer to 370 million than 330 million or 328 million, whatever is being touted. So this would mean, but again, why is the government concealing it? What is the interest that anyone has in having that many illegal people running around the country, flying under the radar? Surely you'd want to deport them. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't any government want to do that? But it seems not. There's an incredible acceptance of taking illegals into the West, obviously globalist controlled and promoted and inspired, but a savage reluctance, an aggressive reluctance to remove these illegals. But even the story on this is interesting because I've noticed that say West Europeans, could be Irish, English, I don't know, Germans, Dutch, Norwegian or whatever, when their visas, say they got a work visa, for example, their visa expires, then they're aggressively chased up, and agents will appear and sort of grab them, put them in the car and drive them to the airport, this type of thing. And yet when it comes to deporting brown and black immigrants, illegal immigrants, then there's a strange softness suddenly appears. Yeah, look, we'll worry about that later. Who cares? Hey, this is not a big deal. But if it's the Irish engineer or the German accountant or something like that, then bingo, you're out of here, motherfucker. And a completely different attitude prevails. So we've got to assume this is not really an issue per se about immigration at all. It's about bringing as many black, brown people into the West as they possibly can do by any means, and going about it as pointedly and aggressively as they can. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.